studying, trying to find something to get you on, but I couldn't find anything really to get you on.
Someone will.
So the objective of this conversation is to map out the range of issues that Governor Patrick has put together to address what I think we all agree is a fundamental threat to the existence of this democracy, the corrupting influence of money and the other issues that we're talking about. And so I'm incredibly honored to be able to have this conversation with you. I also want to begin, though, by thanking Olivia Zink and Open Democracy. This has been an extraordinary run. I'm reminded that it was 6 years ago tonight that we were in Dixville Notch, a bunch of us. We were going to begin a walk from Dixville Notch to Nashua, partly in honor of this extraordinary woman, Granny D. So in the middle of January, we're going to walk across New Hampshire in the name of trying to build this reform movement and wake up so many people in the state to something that I know they felt deep in their hearts. It was an incredible ice storm. And we're at a bar, and we're like, not sure we're going to make it the next morning. And midway through, there's a guy who had obviously too much to drink, one of our people, jumped on a table, and he screamed, "You're all going to die! You can't do this! You're going to die!" All I can report is we're not dead yet. The movement is growing, and this is a real capstone to our conversation. So, the most important words that I saw when I read this incredible plan today in describing this objective is, in the first 100 days, you were going to make these issues a priority. That's important because one of the issues we've been emphasizing is that this is not just about what do we need to fix, it's also the priority of fixing it. Because as you say, this would, quote, enable the success of the other far-reaching legislative proposals. So that sounds clear enough, but can I just ask you to underline it and make it perfectly clear that you see this as the necessary priority for anything else you want to do?
You want me to, first of all, Professor, thank you for moderating this. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Open Democracy for the invitation to be here. I could make it as plain as possible by just taking that card and reading it aloud. I actually wrote that sentence. And look, we have a handful of big ideas, and when I say we, I mean we Americans, on which there is a broad consensus. But they don't happen. And they don't happen because we've been treating our democracy for a long time as if it would tolerate limitless abuse without breaking it. And so the things like the amount of money, much of it dark, the gerrymandering of districts so that, as the phrase goes, representatives choose the voters, not the other way around. The influence of lobbyists, especially lobbyists for money interests. These things conspire, and the voting suppression, and how, frankly, how hard we make it to register to vote. All these things conspire to prevent us from getting democratic outcomes from our democracy. So, my view is we have to start here. We have to go right at that. We have to call it out for what it is and move legislation that makes our democracy function as a representative democracy. If we are to have a fighting chance on big system reforms around healthcare or immigration reform or criminal justice reform and on down the list. And the strategy that we will propose, what we call an opportunity agenda, which is about expanding the economy out to the middle and the marginalized instead of just up to the wealthy.
Okay, so
first 100 days.
First 100 days. We've got that commitment, the most important part. Now, your program outlines 4 areas. 3 of them are pretty familiar, and I want to go through them and make sure that we understand them. The 4th is really interesting, something that we haven't talked about in other contexts, which is the national service. And I want to save that to the end of wrapping up what these questions are about. I want to start with the clean up our politics section, which is the thing that we usually talk about in the context of these issues. And you have a bunch of pretty important, somewhat obvious, some of them, reforms like fixing this broken FEC, addressing something called leadership pacts, which are an extraordinary corruption where politicians basically get to spend campaign money to entertain themselves and their friends, so long as it's having to do with campaigns. Ending super PAC coordination, building up the Office of Government Ethics and lobbying reform, cleaning up foreign money. All of that's really important. The one that I want to...
I feel like there's a but coming.
There's no but. There's no but. But, so the money in politics part is incredibly important. And what you've done here is really interesting because, you know, the baseline position of most Democrats is to talk about a matching fund proposal, which is basically small dollar contributions get matched. Most of them are talking about a 6-to-1 match. You've outlined an 8-to-1 match, so it's a more aggressive match for raising small dollar.
I think that's what New York is doing. I think New York City.
Yeah, so it's actually better than New York. I think.
All right then.
Yeah, so you're better than New York, which, you know, that's important. But the other part that I think is really important is that you're aggressively talking about experimenting with democracy vouchers. Now, 2 weeks ago, Bernie Sanders explained why he, in thinking about public funding, thought vouchers were the really important change to bring about. You know, that both matching funds and vouchers were important. You're advancing a hybrid proposal. It's stronger than, I think Elizabeth Warren wants a 6-to-1 match and not talking about vouchers. So explain to us how you're thinking about why this mix makes the most sense for dealing with what I think of as the central problem of the corrupting influence of money in Congress.
So a couple things. First of all, I'm very interested in innovation in public policy across the board. And I think we should try more than one thing. And by the way, just on that point, to have successful innovation, you need, I believe, a tolerance for failure. We have to raise our tolerance for failure. And I think one of the reasons why we don't get more innovation in politics is because politics punishes failure. So we're all going to have to kind of get comfortable with the idea that we may try a few things simultaneously before we know just what is scalable and what's going to get the greatest impact. So that's a big part of why we landed and how we landed where we did. There is a kind of a redistributive quality of the voucher approach. If the argument of eliminating PACs is limited by Citizens United, then in effect asking that we tax PACs so that we spread that value to other interests in our democracy. Some of you here will think so. That members of Congress want these kinds of changes. You talk to a member of Congress today, and they'll tell you they spend 50 or 60% of their time in office dialing for dollars rather than doing the job. And you can begin to see why. And it's not that I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush, because I think most members of Congress are very honorable people. But you can begin to see why it would be viewed as efficient to give your first dibs on the time in your schedule to someone who is a donor. Because you have to cultivate that relationship, and you have to do it all the time because you're always running. There's so many ways in which, as I say, we have compounded our challenges and made our democracy less democratic. But the specific answer to your question is, I want to try a couple different things to see where we get the biggest pickup.
Okay, because when you describe this fundraising problem, so they spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money, it's the fact that they're raising money from 150,000 Americans, which is the other part of that problem, because those 150,000 Americans don't represent average America. They represent very specific Americans. So expanding the donor pool is an incredibly important part of this. Matching funds would do a little bit, vouchers would do a lot, but I like the idea that we need to experiment with different ways to see what's actually going to be the most effective in changing this.
And there is I have my fantasy. Anybody here from outside the United States? Some of you. Where are you from?
Greece, everybody.
How long does it take? What's the period for an election? How long does it help? How long does it run?
In Greece?
Yes.
It can happen in 3 weeks.
Well, raise your hand. Where are you from? Egypt. Period for elections, when there are elections?
A month or something.
A month?
Yeah.
Anybody else? How long before the left?
6 months, 8 months.
6 to 8, yeah. The
China.
largest population, largest democracy in America, I mean in the world, excuse me. Yes.
China.
Thailand.
China.
China, excuse me. Never mind. No disrespect, I'm sorry. But you understand what I'm saying? We have perpetual elections. Perpetual elections. And which is one of the reasons why I find it so it's so tiresome to be asked constantly, why are you late in this?
I didn't ask you that
No,
question.
no,
but
you
yeah.
didn't. But you know, people are just now starting to focus because they've kind of a lot. Not us. You know, we follow every twist and turn. But a lot of people have the rest of their lives to focus on, and they can't deal with perpetual elections. So I don't know that we are at a point where we can start to regulate the length of time of elections. So please don't report this. That's not what I'm talking about. But I think that that limiting the money may force us as candidates and campaigns to think more strategically about that spend and how to get the most out of it in a more concentrated period of time. That's where I was.
Okay. So in addition to the public funding, which is, I think, the most important change we can make today, you've also identified with every other candidate overturning Citizens United. What do you think the real prospects of an amendment to overturn Citizens United are?
I think there's a lot more energy around these issues than we give ourselves credit for. I mean, amending the Constitution, as you know, is a big deal. It was supposed to be difficult, but I do think we are not alone in feeling that the democracy is not functioning as well as it should, and it comes up not necessarily directly connected to Citizens United, but it comes up around things like gun safety. I remember after Sandy Hook, I was with President Obama, and he said we are certain to get gun safety laws passed. We're certain. Sadly, we often wait until there's a tragedy, but what tragedy could be more compelling than that? And then it didn't. And there's a broad consensus around the things to do. We don't agree on everything, but there's a lot we can do consistent with the Second Amendment. By the way, there's a lot we can do consistent with the views of the membership of the NRA, not the leadership, but the membership of the NRA. That should be acknowledged. But it doesn't happen because we have a system so weighted in favor of the interest that it is. And that's just one example.
Okay, but if you're going to win something like an amendment to overturn Citizens United, you got to talk to more than Democrats, because it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. So what are you going to say to Republicans that would convince them, as much as I think many Democrats are convinced, that this corrupting influence is something we've got to address now?
Well, I guess I would say this. If you think your ideas are compelling, then let's have a fair fight.
Yeah.
If you really believe that you can win, let's have a fair fight. If you believe your ideas are not compelling, that's the only reason not to go down this path. And if that's your issue, I must say that. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not running to be president of the Democrats. I'm running to be president of the United States. And I understand that there will be differing views about some of these, but I don't think you can, regular people, I'm not talking about movement Republicans or activist Democrats, regular people know there's a reason why their democracy and their government makes them feel unseen and unheard. And most of the people I meet are not looking for government to solve every problem in their lives. They just want government to help them help themselves. So I think we have to, being president has a unique, that's a unique pulpit. It's a unique opportunity to carry a message, and I think, with your help and the help of others who are supporters of the objectives of open democracy, we make this a campaign, and we make it a priority, as I said, and I think we get something done.
Okay, that's the cleanup pillar.
By the way,
Yes.
short of reversing Citizens United, I'm very interested in this idea of legislation that defines a corporation as not a person for purposes of the person.
Yeah, we can geek out on First Amendment law.
Yeah,
I'll
so
present.
you should, please let's do geek out,
Yeah.
not in front of everybody.
Okay, that's the first pillar, cleaning up our elections. The second pillar I want to talk about is strengthening democratic institutions. And I love the way you set this off as separate, because this is a long-term project. It's not just about what do we do immediately to reduce the influence of modern politics. And here, there are things that are somewhat obvious, like reinforcing education in our schools about how democracy functions. I love the idea you're talking about statehood for the District of Columbia and for Puerto Rico, which I think would be an important addition to the democratic integrity.
And wouldn't it be a living civics lesson?
Yes.
Just the process of having a real debate about it and moving in that direction is such a teaching opportunity.
It would be great. You have something nobody else has mentioned. You want to have an institution to avoid politically motivated prosecutions, having been at the core of the Justice Department. I'm sure you have a good sensibility about how important that is to maintain the integrity of prosecution. But the one I want to land on for a bit is something so many people are passionate about, the issue of ending gerrymandering. Now, you've identified two strategies here, which I think is really, again, consistent with your let's try everything approach. So one strategy, like H.R. 1, is federal legislation to eliminate partisan gerrymandering in the context of congressional elections. But you also want to encourage stuff at the state level too, and you want to use the Justice Department to push as far as the law will go here. So why don't you talk about that?
So we had one of the trends has been in favor of independent commissions. There's a lot to like about that. We did redistricting when I was governor. It was a legislative commission. It was ridiculously transparent. I mean that in a positive way. It was very open. It was very fair, and it was also made more difficult, I suppose, in some views, easier because we had to reduce the size of our delegation. We were using a congressional seat, but there was a lot of consultation, a lot of engagement from advocacy groups and others, and it was right on the surface. Proposals were put out. They were publicly debated. We got to a pretty good conclusion. And they started with, you all right? They started with the principles of trying to have geographic. Yes, I'm sorry. It's that time of day.
Yeah, okay. Here's some coffee.
Thank you.
It's mine, but go ahead.
Thank you. What did you put in yours?
Nothing.
But having compactness and having trying as much as possible to keep communities of interest, not political interest, but communities geographically rational. There's a lot of sense in that from the perspective of not just how pretty or simpler the map is, but the service of the representative is a lot more straightforward. So I think we got it pretty good. Pretty good outcome with the legislative committee, and I think it's more about the principles than who does it. Bleaching all politics out of it ain't gonna happen, and probably doesn't need to happen. It's the notion of using these incredible, algorithms where the representative chooses the voter rather than the other way around. And by the way, that was just coming on when I was at DOJ. And some of those tools were part of evaluating minority districts when those were being under attack, in the Supreme Court. Just as I was coming in, the science has gone to a whole different.
And the technique is deployed by both sides. So this is really about agreeing to a mutual disarmament as much as it is about picking one side that's really failing to live up to a principle of democracy. One thing that's interesting that I don't see you emphasizing much, but Massachusetts is struggling with it right now, the ballot measure about it, is the question of ranked choice voting. You think about this primary right here. Imagine how much more information we could get out of New Hampshire if in addition to knowing who's going to win the 12% that number one will get and the 11% that number two will get, we could know what would it looked like if you could aggregate the preferences.
Isn't Maine doing this?
Maine does it right now,
Yeah.
exactly right.
Is it doing it in the primary as well?
Because
Because they did it in the governor's race, right?
Yeah, they'll do it in the primary. They chose a representative in the last election, first time that's happened.
Right.
And interestingly, New Hampshire actually, at the original moment when delegates were being selected for the Electoral College, had something like a ranked choice system. So,
Yes.
so it's not foreign to New Hampshire. But so what's your
You
view
know
on
what's so
this?
interesting about this? You know Lonnie Guinier. So Lonnie, does everyone here know who Lonnie Guinier is? She's a absolutely brilliant civil rights lawyer. She was a colleague of mine at the Legal Defense Fund. When I was first starting out, we litigated a number of cases together. In fact, we sued her law school pal, Bill Clinton, when he was governor of Arkansas. And Governor Clinton and I worked out the terms of the settlement, actually ultimately became the bones of the motor voter law when he was elected. Anyway, when he was elected, the first person he nominated to be head of the Civil Rights Division was Lonnie Guinier. I was the third. Her nomination crashed because she had written a controversial article about ranked choice voting. See how things change?
But she was ahead of the time.
She was, as she always has been.
Yeah.
But this whole notion that you have all the benefits you just described of being able to understand who's your second choice and under what circumstances, and how that can factor in judgments of, we are all trying to outsmart each other in terms of the outcomes. I'm talking about we as voters. Outsmart each other in terms of the outcomes. Well, this one's this is the one I really like, but this is the one who's likely to win, and so I'm going to figure out how to cast my vote for the one who's likely to win, so I'm on the winning team, but this is the one I really like. I mean, a lot of that goes away with ranked choice voting. There's a lot to like about it, but like all things, it's new in many places. And so, again, giving people an opportunity to warm up to it, learn from it, improve it. I think that's probably the way to move in that direction instead of saying this is it for it.
So states adopting it, like Maine has, maybe Massachusetts.
It may. Yeah, you said something about it.
Yeah, it's going to be on the referendum ballot in the fall. So this might be the strategy to teach us something about it so we can get that adopted nationally. Okay. You, like others, have talked about abolishing the electoral college. Adopting.
You got to be careful about that in New Hampshire.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we understand exactly what you're thinking. Because, so you talk about a national popular vote, and so that would require a lot of change. I want to ask you about maybe a slight compromise on that. I mean, instead of national popular vote, instead of abolishing the college, what would you think about a proposal that said, let's just divide, let's just allocate the electors proportionally at a state level down to a fractional level? So that
Proportion with the
popular vote in the state. So the top two people in the state, you allocate it to a Democrat in Montana gets 35%, they get 1.067. I think that's the number of electors from that state. So the advantage of that and national popular vote is that under the current system, the only states a president cares about are the swing states. In 2016...
And the people in the other states feel that.
Yeah, of course they do. Like Massachusetts, not necessarily New Hampshire, but Massachusetts. You would like to give up the television ads you get perpetually all the time, maybe. But the point is...
She's nodding her head over there. I just went on TV, so don't blast me, okay?
I'm sorry.
So in 2016, 99% of spending was in 14 states. And what we know, academics know, is that the president bends policy to make those states happy, bends regulation to make those states happy, and the rest of the country feels it. So if you had national popular vote, and if you had proportional allocation to a fractional level, the president would care about everything. Candidates would care about everything. So that would get you almost all the way to national popular vote. So I wonder whether this is still something that we can do.
I love that idea. And if we could do that without the heavy lift of amending the Constitution, even better. I'm not sure we can. The interstate compact between the two I think is a gesture in the direction. This question came up at a senior center in Hampshire recently, And I was asked about the electoral college, and I said, well, it seems like it's such a straightforward principle that the person who gets the most votes is the winner. And we've, especially given the fact that we've had the last few presidents having gotten fewer than the majority of the vote who still became president. And there were some heads nodding and so on. And then someone came up afterwards, actually one of the people who had invited me, and she said, you know, the reason for the electoral college was to make it so that there was an undue weight given to the places where population was concentrated. And so we should pay attention to that, and we care about that in New Hampshire. Well, I get it. There was a reason for the electoral college, or reasons for the electoral college, but that it compromises this very simple idea that the person who gets the most votes should win is a power, and that it causes, as you said, that candidates and frequently office holders pay attention to the places where that are the so-called swing states, and not see themselves as responsible for everyone everywhere is distorting of the actual job.
Yeah, I mean, we should remember, of the swing states, there are only two so-called small states, Iowa and New Hampshire. Every other state, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, these are not small states, right? So whatever people think the framers were talking about when they created the Electoral College 200 years ago, that's not the reality today.
That's a good point.
And so we should think about your principle given the reality today. So I think thinking broadly about it is really important, and I agree. Let's see if we can get it even without an amendment. Okay, the next column.
through a compact without an amendment?
No, you've got to, I mean, again, we can geek out about that. So the next column is, something that you actually put at the very top of your list, which is to make voting accessible and secure. This is something you have a lot of experience with because this is your experience at the Justice Department. When you were governor, you embraced and pushed a whole bunch of important reform around voting. As you said, you helped get the National Popular Vote Compact enacted in Massachusetts. And you have a list, a standard list, some interesting additions. The transgender protection in the voting rights is an interesting addition to what others have been talking about. Two questions. One, felon disenfranchisement. So the debate here is, okay, everybody's talking about re-enfranchising.
You know, you're joining, the whole point is to rejoin productive life. And there are many other things we need to do to fix reentry. But having this alongside something, quite like that. I'm not sure that for felons, now misdemeanors is a different question, but for felons that having the vote during incarceration is where I want to land. But talk to you.
The second important part of this, something again you have a lot of experience on, with in the United States Supreme Court in a case called Shelby County, basically gutted the Voting Rights Act, which is the most important reform legislation in the civil rights space, I think, in 150 years. And really was having an incredible effect across many districts, not just in the South. You've talked about restoring the Voting Rights Act, which of course many people have supported. But the question I want to ask you is, what do you think is really motivating these techniques to make it harder for people to vote? One theory is it's race. Another theory is it's
there
just
is
politics.
no other theory.
Well, what is the question? Okay. The other argument is it's politics. You know, and especially when you've got.
And the difference from.
Here's why it's important. Here's why it's important. If it's politics, then you don't necessarily, this is going to be a little bit law geeky, but I think you'll get it. You don't necessarily have to talk about it under the 14th Amendment. You can talk about it under Article 1, Section 4. You can talk about the power of Congress to guarantee equality in the elections without needing to jump through the hoops of the Supreme Court. I like that word, say it again.
Brilliant.
Without jumping through the hoops that the Supreme Court has created under that. So
I hear where you're going. That's terrific. I'm open to that. I don't want to pretend like what's happening isn't happening, because it was pretending that what's happening isn't happening and how we got to Shelby's
Absolutely.
decision. Remember, the Chief Justice said we don't need justice in effect. We don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore because everything's changed. And then, what was it, 10 minutes after that decision came down, everybody went back to doing what they used to do. And shamelessly. You know, 2 elections we are very clear on in Georgia and Florida were basically stolen. And the purging, which has always blown my mind. I mean, I'll just give you an example of this. This is not all race, but just how we seem to go out of our way to make access to the ballot hard. We were off the ballot, then on the ballot, and then off the ballot in Michigan. How? The way it works in Michigan is that you have to be on the list that the head of the party gives to the Secretary of State. There were 2 candidates who had not announced. One's name she put on that list, and the other she didn't. So then we said, wait a second, how come he's on, we're not? And we're told, sorry, what you have to do now to get on the ballot is collect signatures. And we collect more signatures than any other candidate ever and submit them. And then the Secretary of State disqualifies a large portion of those signatures. Why? Why? Those people disqualified can vote. But the address where they live today, which was on the signature form, is different than the address at which they live. They can still vote, but they can't sign the ballot. We go out of our way to make it hard to participate. It's not all race, but whether there's a reason behind it or not, we need to examine how using current technologies and using a value set that says we want people to participate, because in a democracy we get the government we deserve, and we deserve better government than we often get.
Okay, the last point you make, you're calling for a 90% participation rate in voting. That's the highest standard anybody has set. And I want to work with you. I think that's the most important.
Might as well be first.
Yeah, first, really important. Okay, now we have a special question, and then we're going to go to general questions, and then I want you also to talk about that national service. But I was so excited to see a college friend of mine, a guy you might have heard of, Frank Luntz, here in the room. Now, Frank Luntz is famous, of course, to the world, not because he's been a Democratic activist his whole life. In fact, maybe the opposite. But Frank has become really incredibly engaged in a lot of these issues of reform, and he's brought a group of students from all across the world here. And I wanted to ask Frank if you wanted to offer a reaction or a question first.
Very short.
Frank, you need this?
No, I went to school at Oxford. I did 24 hours. I promise you I will do 24 seconds here. My students, raise your hands. I apologize, Governor. This is not going to be a walkout, but as soon as I'm done, we are going to a focus group where we were going to test your messaging. I think it's going to do quite well.
Okay. I think what you just did is a push-pull, right? Where you suggest what the outcome's supposed to be. Everybody say this is good.
If the money is right, I can assure you but Professor Lessig is correct. That money is corrupting our political system. And it took me a while to come to that point of view. And that's why I'm standing before you right now. And it is a serious problem, and it needs a solution. But it cannot just be solved by Democrats, or by Democrats and independents as it is here in New Hampshire. Republicans have to be part of it. So my question to you is, how do you, it's not a matter of beating them.
Yep.
It's a matter of bringing them on,
That's right.
pulling them in.
That's right.
You, as governor, found a way to govern across the aisle. How do you convince Republicans that that agenda is not just good for the country, but good for them as well? Maybe that's the answer. How do you win Republicans?
So I think, somebody asked me the other day, Frank, about the composition of the Senate and how, don't we have to work to have more Democrats and a majority of Democrats in the Senate in order to drive this agenda of ours, not just this one, but my agenda across the board as president. And I said, you know what, I'd love to have some more Democrats, but I'd take a few patriots. We have got to start making the case, we on both sides have got to start making the case about what is good for us. Not what's good for our party, but what's good for us. And that's a hard case to make in an environment where the sort of muscle memory more and more is about what's good for the party, or if you're talking about something else, what you really need is what's good for the party. I think if the ideas are compelling, then they will be compelling. And you don't actually have to, one doesn't actually have to cheat to win. Timing often affects outcomes. Other competing agenda often affect outcomes. But when you know that we have national consensus around issues like many of the gun safety measures, or the key elements of comprehensive immigration reform, or frankly even choice. I think it's closer in that case, but even choice. And you can't get action. I'm not saying the vote's always going to go the way I want it to, but I'd rather have the vote. I'd rather actually get to the. So I think maybe, Frank, what I want to say to you is, in my experience, getting change that lasts requires that you bring lots of voices in, and when you have that win, it's our win and not just mine. When I describe that as a leadership strategy, nowadays, folks say you're talking about being a moderate, this is not time to be a moderate. But increasingly, I think a moderate is a progressive who actually has results to point to. I'm not talking about a moderate agenda. I'm talking about ambitious and progressive goals, but I think it requires some humility alongside the boldness in order to get stuff that sticks. And that means you got to bring in folks with
Governor, Professor, the world is watching. The world is in this room now, 11 countries that are, again, not walking out, but we need to get to the bus. So that's your cue, my students, to get up and don't leave anything behind. But,
thanks a million, Frank.
Governor, I wish you success.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the students. All the best and welcome.
Okay, we're going to go to questions, but I want you to talk about the one thing that nobody else is talking about in the context of democracy reform. Why do you see national service as part of democracy reform?
That's why you were pointing. You've got a city in your back. You know, I went to this security briefing of a group called the Aspen Strategy. Everybody know what they are? It's a group of senior foreign policy and military or intelligence folks. So think of State Department Secretary, NSA Director level, bipartisan. They've been meeting for 40 years, a couple times a year. And what they do is very quietly try to come up with a proposed solution on a bipartisan basis or a nonpartisan basis to some current public policy or diplomatic challenge. And they have a couple of guests at each of their meetings, and I was one of two guests at this session. And at that session, we got the security briefing on what actually happened with Russian interference in the 2016 election. It was just what was particularly for me powerful is that they just turned to us on us. And not just that it happened, but that it was so easy. And one of the reasons I think we are so easily divided is that we don't know each other. You know, we get a cartoon version of each other, a one-dimensional version of one another. Different parties, different parts of the country, different parts of the town. And I think I've been sensitive to this all along as a black man, because I know the first impression many people have of me, especially if I'm in comfortable clothes and a baseball cap. I've crossed those streets at the wall sign and had people lock their doors And I'm like the least scary person on the planet. But you know, we do this now in our haste, in our carelessness, of trying to reduce people to a fraction of the complexity they are. And I think that's easy to do if you don't know people who are doing things. National service, military or civilian, is a way, I think, to bring together people from different parts of the country, different parts of different perspectives and backgrounds, in service of an unmet need, and to give people the experience of working along someone who is really different and having to learn that. And I've had, you know, the majority of my life in that setting ever since I left the South Side of Chicago at 14 and came to Milton Academy. You talk about two different worlds. But learning that I had to figure out who I was and be that all the time, as the only way to move among lots of different worlds I was curious about, and becoming curious about, not jumping to the conclusion that the cartoon is all I see. And I think that's important, Professor, because we live in a time and moment where we are constantly peddled false choices. I'm a Democrat. I am proud to be a Democrat. You do not have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat. You don't have to hate business to be a social justice warrior. You don't have to hate police to believe Black Lives Matter. But we get these false choices all the time, and we are made to feel like we have to choose the one or the other, really in service of our division rather than in service of problem solving. In that trade. Yes. Yeah, okay. You too?
I was just smart thinking if I can serve at 21 and die, I think I should really drink at 18.
Yeah. Yeah, 18. I had a feeling we would get to the drinking soon. It was 18 when I was in school. Yeah. I'm not sure it was a good idea, but...
Okay, so you pushed automatic voting, voter registration. Did you mandate, you're going to mandate it for all states?
Yes.
So wouldn't policing voter purges require federal legislation to erase maximum, and to ensure maximum compliance? What would you do to ban voter ID laws?
So I think, again, we have this, so there are a couple things there. The purging is deeply concerning to me because there are a whole lot of reasons why people don't vote. I wish they did, but they choose not to in some cases. It's not just that they're careless. And if you choose not to, and again, I'd rather it weren't so, but if you choose not to, it doesn't seem to me you should be punished. You should lose your access to the vote if you haven't done it in a certain period of time. Now, if same-day registration were in place, or automatic registration, you could show up and register and vote, then purges of this kind would be less consequential. But again, it's the intersection of these things that is such a problem. I think in terms of voter ID, we have so many more technologies available to us today to make it possible for people to say, to demonstrate that they really are who they are at polling places. But you go to a lot of polling places and it's a cardboard box with a slot in the top. It's charming, but it's indicative of our slowness to embrace appropriate technologies to make access simple.
Okay, so this question's not
Does
just...
that make sense?
It does.
But you want to push back.
I don't want to push back on that. I want to embrace that. I want to move to this question. I'm doing your own service to the audience here. This is a really interesting question, not directly in our space, but I want to see. When the United States votes, the rest of the world is affected. Taking into consideration last week's incident in Iran, what would be some key points of your foreign policy that I think might link to this project of democracy?
Wow. Which question was that?
I think it was the fellow sitting there.
That's a really profound question. This whole mindfulness of the leadership we have had in the world, and what responsibilities that brings on us. I'm looking at you because you were sitting next to me. I feel like looking to say something. So I think that think that we are strongest, well, let me put it this way. Maybe I'll start here. How many people have traveled outside the United States?
Wow.
The first time I traveled outside of the United States was when I was 20, and I had a fellowship to spend a year in a non-Western culture. I wanted to go to Africa. I'd never traveled outside the United States. I wanted to go to Africa. I wrote to everybody I knew who knew somebody in Africa, and I got one response from a guy on a UN project in Sudan, from Khartoum. And he said, "I'm not sure what you do, but we'll figure it out when you get here." And so I set off with a backpack, and I'm from the south side of Chicago. We don't do this. A backpack. I taught myself the numbers and the greetings in Arabic on the flight from Athens to Cairo. I spent 3 weeks in Cairo, and then I hitchhiked from Cairo to Khartoum. It took about 3 weeks, about 1,200 miles, over every kind of conveyance. And I found the office of the guy I've been writing to, and learned when I got there that he had left the week before for 2 years in Long Beach, California. And said nothing to his office about my coming. I will shorten and say that I talked early on the project, and basically to get rid of me, they sent me 600 miles across the Nubian Desert to Darfur, where I lived without, mail service, phone service for several months. If my kids tried this today, I'd kill them. But I got, you figure it out, right? I learned the language, I learned how to feed myself, how to live, how to amuse myself, how to do the assignment I'd been given. And as I began to make friends with people, folks would ask me completely guileless questions. And I'll never forget one from a guy who was probably then the age I am now, who said, "I remember reading once," this is 1978, "I remember reading once about a civil rights movement in the United States. What happened to it?" And you can't fake that answer, right? Because they're listening for that answer. The reason I ask how many people have been outside the United States is because the first time I understood deeply, bless you, the power of our values was from the outside looking back.
Yeah.
That sound familiar? And it was then that I began to realize that is our edge in the world. Countries of great wealth and mighty armies have come and gone with the winds of time. What's different about us is that we're the only nation in human history organized around a set of civic ideals. And over time and through struggle, we have defined those ideals as equality, opportunity, and fair play. And the gap between those ideals and our reality is the work of this moment, and frankly, ought to have been the work of every generation. So it's a long way round to make a point. When I think about our place in the world, I think about the active work of closing the gap between our reality at home and those ideals, and how that makes us stronger, not just at home, but also abroad. And that, I think, is the source not just of our strength, but of our leadership. So we got a lot of work ahead.
You've kind of demonstrated the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. You've addressed the question of accessibility in education. However, don't you think it's also important to target youth by promoting the role of civic education? Your plan has an important civic education part to it.
Yes.
So why don't you talk about that?
Well, when I was running for governor, you will remember, but others may not, it was the first thing I'd ever run for. And the dynamic at home in Massachusetts, it's not so much Democrat, Republican as it is inside or outside. It was a really tight, closed and inward-looking political establishment. So we ran practically and frankly also philosophically a very grassroots campaign. So I was talking to everyone. And as people warmed to the campaign and they turned it from my campaign to their own, it was their cause, then folks would start to tell me what their list of, what I used to tease about, their list of non-negotiable demands were. And folks would say, I need you to make sure that I have access to cell service. Everybody else on my block has it, but I don't. And and I want you to take care of that. Or they would say, you know, there's a pothole down the street, and it has been unfilled in my town for a long, long time, and you need to promise me you're going to look after that. It really doesn't do to say, you know, actually that's the mayor or the town council's responsibility, not mine. But it was reflective of how we don't understand the levels of government. The number of times I had people say, you need to reverse a decision of our SJC, which is our high court. It doesn't actually work that way. Or even members of the legislature who would talk about the three branches of government: the governor, the Senate, and the House. I know that's not actually three branches of government. I mean, there is a we're not as informed as, and it's not that I'm saying, I'm not talking down to anybody. I'm simply saying, in order to understand how to influence our government, we have to understand how it's organized. In order to understand what to fix, we have to understand where it's organized, how it's organized, so that we get at the part that's broken. And civics education, I think, is a big part of it.
You support overturning Citizens United. Do you support overturning Buckley versus Vallejo? Do you support the 28th Amendment, which New Hampshire has become the 20th state calling for a 28th Amendment addressing money in politics? It seems those answers are clear.
Yes.
Yes. Here's a harder question. I'm not sure where I would be on this, so you should take a lot of space on it. Big money contributions by the fossil fuel industry have helped them continue receiving subsidies while they subject American communities to pollution and partisanship. Will you join every other Democratic candidate in pledging not to take contributions over $200 from any fossil fuel executives, lobbyists, or PACs?
Yes. Whose question was that?
That's mine, and you would sign it.
I'm going to tell you why you got a moment's hesitation, and if you're reporting, please do. I worked at Texaco, and I was there, you may know, because the court appointed me first as a special master to fix a broken employment system, and came in and finished that work. What you may not know is that we did some really important work to be the first so-called big oil company to pull out of the coalition and that funded the so-called research opposing climate change, the very first. And then we were merged or sold to Chevron. So it disappeared in history. My point is, and the reason I hesitated is, we had allies there. We had allies on that journey there. They worked in that company, but they understood the importance of moving to a clean. This is, what, 20 years ago? The importance of moving to a clean energy future. So the question of not taking money from oil and gas PACs, or frankly any other corporate PAC, I'm there. But the question of not taking money from people who work in those industries as if they are themselves bad, I know that. And that's why I hesitate. So I get the point. I'll sign this if you want to. But I think one of the things that I have tried to be careful of, and it kind of goes back to a point I was trying to make in response to Frank, is that we have allies in places that we don't always credit, and we're going to need them to get from here to where we want to be. So thank you.
Because, you're running for president. You've already brought up the late points, which people have remarked on. It's easy to run for president when you're a billionaire. It's easy to run for president when you're super famous. It's because you can raise lots of money very easily. We don't have a public funding system for president that is worth anything. So I imagine it's a very hard question for a campaign like yours. You're not a billionaire, I take it. And in Massachusetts you're famous, but you're not famous across the country yet. It must be hard to decide how to run a campaign when you know there are real obstacles to getting your message out, and you need resources to make that possible. So how do you think about that choice?
Well, I think, first of all, you were right about all the predicates. I'm not a billionaire. I'm not a celebrity. I'm also not sensational. because in my experience, that's not actually how you make change that lasts. To the point I was trying to make earlier, it's a combination of being bold in the agenda and humble in the approach that gets those results, and due respect to my friends in the race and others. No one in the race has the breadth of life and leadership experience I have building bridges to get change that lasts. Public, private, domestic, and overseas. We are racing to be competitive. I have never been in a race where I wasn't outspent. But it's hard. It's supposed to be hard, by the way. What's interesting is that the folks who were apparently on time and spent months and months and millions of dollars have not locked it down. The person who's, or the figure who's leading is somebody called undecided. 60 to 70% in each of the early stages. So there's clearly an opening. And the reception's been quite warm. What I'm fascinated by, and have been in every single cycle, whether I'm in it or not, is the way folks wait for permission to decide whom they're going to back. I've had more than one conversation with people saying, "You are really my guy. You're exactly what I want, but I'm afraid I need to vote for this one or that one who is not my guy or gal because they are leading in the polls." And all I'm saying is, don't wait for somebody else to give you permission. There are a lot of great candidates, but if you want to take a chance, don't take a chance on me. Take a chance on your own aspirations. And if you want to take a chance on your own aspiration, I'm telling you, I have a record of delivering against those aspirations that's simply different from everybody else in this race.
Governor, you've been a hero in our state. You're late for the best possible reasons. It shows a commitment to values that all of us love and respect. And what you've done today with the announcement of the democracy agenda and the way you've articulated here shows at least me, and I know many in this room, that you understand what it's going to take. And I'm so grateful you're going to fight, even though late, to make people understand exactly what it's going to take. Please join me in thanking
Thank you very much.